So we can begin. First and foremost, thank you all for logging on this Thursday afternoon at 3 p.m. Central Standard Time. This is the last webinar in our series. The first one was from Department of Health, how to become a shellfish handler and dealer, how to obtain those licenses. The second one, we were lucky enough to have Rusty Grice, which is a business specialist from Mississippi, Alabama, to come and speak to us on how to maintain and manage a business in oyster aquaculture. And the one yesterday was very informative, which was we had Dr. Lindsay Campbell from Texas Parks and Wildlife, which is the coastal permitting specialist that deals with the permitting of all these farms and nurseries and hatcheries that are coming up online. And this last one, it's probably going to be short, I'm guessing half an hour, but this is hurricane preparedness for oyster mariculture. So this is basically, I wanted to cover the introductory planning guide for tropical storms and hurricane preparedness for off-bottom aquaculture in the Gulf of Mexico. One thing that the Northeast and the Northwest doesn't really have to worry about are hurricanes and storms as frequently as the Gulf of Mexico. So what we did, or not me, but what the Gulf of Mexico Sea Grant did was they came up with an advisory plan, which we will talk about, which is the basis on this presentation. But it really is to help to answer questions and have a hurricane plan, which will really try to save you and save your farm in case these hurricanes happen. And I hate to say it, but when I'm talking to farmers, I don't say if a hurricane hits you, it's when a hurricane hits you or a storm. So this will also help you, people that have not been conditionally approved or permitted, that they're still filling out the permitting application, because this does come up in one of the questions, question 10, where it asks to please provide details on a hurricane and storm plan. They should include management details for the protection of all the equipment and oysters beginning 72 hours before the projected landfall, and what specific factors are considered when deciding when to execute the plan. So this can really help you in formulating a plan and trying to save your farm in case a hurricane or storm does happen. So this is the resource that we use. Texas Parks and Wildlife, they base their hurricane preparedness plan on this one. So this was developed through a consortium between Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, sea grants, because it really has devastated the oyster aquaculture farms when these do happen, and they're actually happening with more frequency. So on the top left is the website, but you can obviously just Google Florida shellfish aquaculture hurricane preparedness plan, and it will come up. And also another thing is that it's got very detailed PDFs that talk about different aspects of oyster farming and the type of different off-bottom oyster farming that you do, whether it be adjustable long lines, floating cages, floating bags, your land-based operations, because people have cages out, they have processing centers, hatcheries, nurseries, different things like that, and how to protect your boats and different aspects like that. So we're just going to cover it probably about 40,000 feet above. But if you want to go into specifics, especially for your permitting, I highly recommend to look at these, read them, and they're very informative. So as of 2022, obviously the hurricane season is from June to November, so it's a large part of our active year in oyster aquaculture. It's from the summer to late fall, when a lot of us in oyster aquaculture are doing most of the work, which is harvesting, splitting, just taking care of rearing your oysters. And this was obviously the tropical names. And we went through they went through pretty much all of them, if they were not hurricanes, or were tropical storms or depressions. So it's something to take into consideration and be very aware of. The projections, this was in August, the update is that the seasonal probability, it's going from near normal to 60% of it is above normal. So the hurricane frequencies are happening a lot more frequently. And it really just devastated in the last 2 years, Louisiana and Alabama, where they really got hit with a lot of their oyster farms being destroyed or really hurt, and even their hatcheries. And those farmers that are trying to acquire seed or already have their farm, they had a little bit of a difficulty in trying to obtain seed, because most of the hatcheries that are set up that we try to get our oyster seed from are in those areas that were pretty much really hit badly. So a little history of this oyster aquaculture is that since 2010, there's been over 200 farms along the Gulf of Mexico, and now it's in Texas. Most of them are smaller farms, about 1 to 2 acres. They're very mom and pop operations. But the thing is that in Texas, we've only got 3 permitted farms. But the trend that we're seeing in Texas is that they're typically larger farms. Between 2 acres is on the smaller side, but we're talking about farms that are about 5 to 10 to 15 acres. So it's something to take into account, because it's a lot more work to try to prepare these, to try to get these these farms prepared for hurricanes and to safeguard them against it. So the thing about oyster aquaculture, with these farms and the hurricanes, is that these events they're extreme, and they really do pose a high threat to farmers in these coastal areas. It's very different from terrestrial farming, and most of these events are out of the farmer's control, and you get damages from these storms and hurricanes due to wind, storm surges. Obviously, later on, decreased salinity due to flooding, to where you will get a freshen event, which is really going to hinder your oysters and can potentially cause increased mortality, loss of gear, equipment, and increased labor. So one thing that NOAA's projecting, and their projections, they see a trend that early throughout the hurricane season, you'll start to see it usually moves from west to east. So you'll start seeing hurricanes or storms hitting the western part of the Gulf, which is Louisiana and Texas. And later on throughout the season, around October, November, you'll start seeing hurricanes hitting the east side of the Gulf of Mexico, which is in Florida. So when developing this plan, since a lot of you all don't have oysters in the water, some of you all do, there's things to consider. So what you want to do is, when you're trying to plan your farm location, there's certain things that you want to take into consideration. And when I talk to farmers, I always try to emphasize depth is one thing to consider. You always want to have your farm deeper. If you're using floating gear, it's different from Australian longline, but the majority of farmers that I've seen, they're choosing to go with floating bags or floating cages, which you can be in 5 feet or 500 feet of water. It really doesn't matter, because you're going to be working on a boat. So one thing that I really try to emphasize is going for a farm that has a good amount of depth, at least 6 feet deep during a low tide. I'm talking about a new moon, full moon, low tide, where you'll see the extremes. And the reason I really try to emphasize that is because if a hurricane or storm does come, farmers typically, they drop their cages down to the bottom of the water. Well, if you have a farm that's about 6 feet deep, there's going to be more of a difference at the bottom of the farm than at the top. And it's going to be a lot more static than the than the things that are happening at the top of the water column, like storm surges, reverse storm surges, things like that. And also there's usually with a lot of hurricanes and storms, there's a lot of rain, and these areas are typically stratified where salt water is denser. So your oysters will be typically in a safer location where it's not moving as much and it's saltier water. Another thing to look into when you're choosing your site for hurricanes and storms is to find an area that has, excuse me, some protection from the wind. It's always good to find an area that's close to higher ground that will break the fetch, also known as the wind that's coming from offshore, to really protect the farm, but also to help you manage your farm and work your farm on a daily basis. The reason why is because Texas, it's not really a tidally dominated, it's not tidally dominated system. It's more of a wind driven system, to where we always get winds and choppy water. So it's something to consider. And also farm access. This is obviously for farm management economics, but also looking at that in case of storms, things like that, because what happens a lot of the times is that marinas get shut down, roads get shut. So it's always good to have more than one access point to your farm. Another thing to look into when developing a plan is your business information. Look at insurance policies, your financial documents. It's always good to have them saved on electronic files like a USB or on the cloud. But when you're trying to get your information to the insurance company or to different agencies that need the information, and there's power outages or water damage that can affect your electronics, it's always good to have hard copies, to always have that on hand. And it's always recommended to have it in more than one place, just in case this information gets damaged. Another really important thing is to have your coordinates, your maps, your diagrams of your farm layout and the gear that's in the water, because you are really going to want to know what you have. And going with landmarks to try to get to your farm after a storm or a hurricane, well, things change. Certain posts are not there, certain markers are not there anymore. So if you, like they say, if you miss by an inch, you miss by a mile. So it's always good to have the GPS coordinates on your phone or a handheld GPS, to where you can have this information readily available. Another thing to have into consideration for developing this plan is a good inventory of the equipment that you have on land, as well as, like, for example, your tumblers, your pressure washers, your extra cages, as well as pumps for filtration if you have farms or hatcheries set up. But also know what you have in the water, because you will be able to assess what has been lost and what is still on your farm, so that you can essentially essentially go out and try to find your gear in case it's lost. Which another part of that's really helpful is to have gear tags. Texas Parks and Wildlife, they require having gear tags for all your gear that's in the water at all times. That's just really to minimize derelict gear in case it gets lost, and also to heighten the probability of your gear getting back to you, because it'll have your information on it. Whether they report it to you or Texas Parks and Wildlife, it's highly more probable if they have the information that they'll get back to you. Another important thing to have, which a lot of people don't think about on regularly for storms and this and that, is to have photos with geotags, but also timestamps before and after a farm, just so you can report these things and assess loss and damage for personal reasons, such as, financial losses, and also for insurances, different things like that. One of the agencies through the USDA is the Farmer Services Agency's non-insured crop farmer assistance program, which is also called the NAP. That's the old one, and that would assist farmers with essentially recouping money that was lost, or gear that was lost, recouping funds from that. That was the old program. It's still in effect, but recently, I believe last year, they came up with a new program, and this one is actually called the ELAP program. So farmers, they're already on the farm, or if you are conditionally permitted or going through the permitting, this is actually a really good program to be in. This is basically for farmers, including oyster aquaculture farmers through the USDA. And it's actually, it doesn't cost anything. You basically just have to register your farm online. You just basically have to register your farm online, so it's on the census, and join the program, which is free of cost. And you can recoup up to 80% of your losses. Should floating bags be submerged pontoons up or cages up? We'll get to that. But the thing is, it's highly recommended that if you do submerge your gear, to always have it pontoons down and oysters up. The reason why is because there's typically a sediment buildup, and you want to keep your oysters off the bottom of the water, because after a storm, you will get more sediment buildup on your cages. And if you have your oysters a couple of inches off the bottom, which would be like that if you had pontoons down, it would really help you to decrease mortality of the oysters because of filtration and clogging of its filter mechanism and suffocation of the oyster. So the part is developing a plan. What you really want to do is develop the plan and know who your essential personnel are, whether they are of another farm that's located next to you or your employees. One thing that's important is to develop essential personnel who will be needed to help you during in preparation of a storm or after the storm has already passed, to assess it. With these larger farms that are happening in Texas, I know that we're starting off small, but the thing is that as these farms grow and the number of employees grow, there's going to be a lot of employees that focus on different things, whether it be the hatchery or the nursery or processing oysters or being out there in the farm. And they're really not cross-trained in all different aspects, because a lot of times it's unessential. A farmer doesn't even know how to process oysters if that's not their job title, or that's not what they're doing. But the thing is that it's always good to cross-train your employees in knowing at least how to sink or recover oysters in case these hurricanes happen, because you will get increased labor at a shorter time, and it'll also be more hands on the water to get things done faster. Another thing is to have a written plan. It's not overkill. It's just good to have a written plan with how to recover gear and secure the gear. But also, it's really important to have a written plan with emergency contacts, whether that be Texas Parks and Wildlife, FEMA, local authorities, different things like that, just to have that on hand in case anything happens on the farm. And one of the things is that it's very helpful to try and sink your cages and know how long it takes you to sink them, as well as how much time it takes you to bring them back up. The reason why is because a lot of people they assume it's going to take a certain time. But if you have a farm that's about 10 acres and you have about 500 cages out in the water, it might take you a lot longer to sink the cages or bring them up in the assumed time that you projected. So it's always good to have practice drills, and maybe just once a year. It really depends on the farm, or as a new employee gets trained to show them how to drop the cages and how to bring them back up. This was put out by NOAA, and this was a hurricane preparedness and recovery plan for oyster aquaculture farms. So this is a list of things to have on hand. Obviously, when there's hurricanes and storms, there sometimes is shortage of supplies, or stores and certain services might go down. So it's always good to have these on hand, such as extra batteries, fire extinguisher, flashlights in case the power goes out, spare batteries, fuel filters, toolkit, scuba gear, especially if you need assistance in bringing back the cages, extra everything, extra anchors, ropes, lines, because one thing you will see is there will be a lot of damage on the farm. So it's also good to have extra gear when you're going out there, or when you're preparing to sink your cages, because a lot of time is assessing your lines to make sure they're not fouled up, or they're loose, or there's some torn or broken lines that would not survive a hurricane. So it's always good to have this gear on hand, stored away, just in case a hurricane would come, or at least to have this gear on hand during hurricane season, because a lot of times even food sometimes is scarce, or potable water. So the way the hurricane preparedness works is that it works basically on it's kind of like a stoplight system, where it's code yellow, code orange, and code red, and they're very self-explanatory. So obviously, NOAA does a very good job in forewarning whether there's a hurricane coming to the Gulf of Mexico, and it usually starts from the Caribbean and it works its way up. So that is the time where it's a code yellow. And that's where you actually begin preparations in obtaining your gear, obtaining the items that you're going to need, as I previously mentioned, but also start preparations on securing your boats, checking your lines, different things like that. You will want to pull your boat out of the water. That's highly recommended, and try to weigh it down. It's highly recommended to fill your boat up with about a third full of water, so it'll help hold it down. And that's where you start securing your boat. 36 hours, you really want to get your boat out of the water and secure it before the roads start closing, and you get closures like marinas, and begin towing from the water or near the water as fast as possible. Try to get these boats out of the area, or secure them as closely as possible. And the code red, when the storm warning has been issued, you want to start finalizing your preparations and finish securing. And obviously, safety first, you want to get out of the area as soon as possible. Now, going with on the water, what you're going to want to do with the adjustable long line, that is very different from the floating cages and floating lines. Adjustable long lines, they're basically on a wire with PVCs. So you're going to basically want to start looking at density checks, and really just, no matter what type of gear you have, you want to start looking at your lines, looking at the integrity of the lines, looking if the lines are chafing, things like that. And you want all your bags secured. If there's questionable clips or wires or ropes that are questionable, you want to start to replace those as fast as possible, or add another line and just really secure them. And you really want to try to remove as much biofouling as possible, because the thing is that biofouling, obviously oyster spat or barnacles, can increase the probability of the chafing of the lines and popping your gear or damaging your gear when a hurricane event is actually happening. that's when you want to start doing that with code yellow, with obviously start securing your boat if this is on the water. At 36 hours before landfall, you're going to want to recheck your fouling to minimize the wear on the line, because it really can inhibit the line and cause the line to pop, and then you lose all your gear. And then you start lowering your cages. You lower your Australian longline, adjustable longline systems to the bottom of the water, because it'll be safer at the bottom of the water. And then once the storm warning has been issued, you do your last farm check and try to get out there, try to get out of the water as soon as possible. So this is an example of what you really want to look at for the adjustable long lines. So there's two types of tensioning lines that are there for Australian long lines. There's the donut tensioner, and then there's a turnbuckle. What you really want to do is tension your lines and get rid of any slack or bowing that'll happen, to really try to minimize the amount of movement that's going to happen with those lines, and hence your cages, because more movement can obviously be more detrimental, cause chafing, cause things to pop, and lose your gear. That's an example of some of the fouling that you want to do, that you want to get rid of. Obviously make sure that you secure your lines with adjustable long lines. As you can see in this photo, these are riser clips that a lot of farmers use, especially in Florida. And they put two bolts, one at the top and one at the bottom, so that you won't have your cages rise to the top during a hurricane event. So this is more applicable for Texas, because as far as I'm aware, most of the people trying to start farms or already farming are using floating cages or floating bags. So what you want to do, obviously, it's a yellow, orange, red system. So what you really want to do, it's same for Australian longline. You want to check your densities. You want to look at your lines for chafing, both your main lines and also your lateral lines. You want to double check your bridles to see if they're weathered or if they can handle a storm. If not, please replace them as fast as possible. One thing that I've seen different farmers from different states do is that at times the pontoons, they have screws at the end where it lets water in. One thing that's highly recommended is to put some silicone grease, or some people use petroleum jelly to put it on the screws for the caps, so that they won't seize up. Obviously, it's hydrophobic, so it'll really try to keep the water out and protect your gear, and really stopping your caps from seizing up, which can really hinder you when you're trying to lower your cages into the water and taking those caps off. That's one thing to do on code yellow. Just go out there and look at your cages and look at all your lines and replace them if you need to. When code orange happens, 36 hours before landfall, you want to recheck and really just try to get rid of the fouling, as I stated before, because the fouling can really affect your farm and really cause these lines to pop. If you decide not to sink, some people decide not to sink their cages and let them ride. It's always recommended to allow enough slack on your main line so that your cages, your floating cages and floating bags will ride over the storm surge, and it won't cause tension to where it'll cause your main line to pop. That's what's recommended. But if you decide to sink your cages, then you put pontoons facing down, obviously, to minimize sediment accretion and burial for your oysters, which can cause mortality, because it can clog those filtering the filtering pumps in the oyster, And then obviously code red, once the storm issue has been warned, you should have already prepped, checked your lines, and just really get out safely. These are two of the anchors that are used for floating cages and floating bags. Most people use the helical anchors, that's on the right, but some people use the arrowhead anchors. And if you choose to, if you sink your cages, it's at the oyster farmers decision. They can always add more anchors to the lines, or maybe put another anchor in the middle of the main line to try to really keep all your gear down. And it really will help minimize more damage to your farm and minimize losses to do that. Another thing that I always ask farmers is whether they're going to have a davit on their boat. And the davit is a really recommended piece of equipment to have on the boat for daily oyster use, but also to have during a hurricane or storm event in case you're going to sink your cages. Because the thing that can happen is the pontoons, you put your oysters pontoons down, but the thing is that with sediment accretion, because of all the sloshing around in the water, there's times where you can get like a foot or two of sediment or silt build up on your cages, and sometimes they will typically at times stick to the bottom of the water column. So therefore, it's almost like a suction to where you really need a davit to where you can actually do that, to where it can pop the suction off and you're able to bring your cage back out of the water. And you can obviously get in the water and scuba dive for them, but it's always highly recommended to have a davit on the boat to where you can pull your oysters out, especially if you have more than 100 oyster cages out there. Because one thing that happens is that after the hurricane happens, you want to get out there safely once it's safe out there, but you want to get to your oysters within 2 days post hurricane, because more than likely your oysters are buried in the sediment and it's not cold weather, so they are suffocating. I got a question. How long are the helical anchor, folks? How long are the helical anchor, the ones that are being used in Texas? Typically, the helical anchors that Texas farmers are using, you basically have a 6-inch disc with a 6-foot anchor, and the anchor you will actually you'll dig it into the sediment all the way to where just the loop is out, maybe about 3 inches exposed from the bottom of the sediment. And it's also a good thing to have it really down in there, because it can really protect the helical anchor from oxidation and rusting. So they go with bigger anchors, 6-inch disc with about a 6-foot anchor. After the storm happens, obviously personal obligations are first and foremost. Make sure that you're safe, your family's safe. And then once you go out there, go out very cautiously, because there might be things that are submerged in the water column that you might not see, like driftwood, other things that can obviously damage your farm and your boat. But it's always, this is a perfect example on why I highly recommend farmers to and Texas Parks and Wildlife requires it to tag all your gear, because it will happen to where you will lose gear. And several farmers in Texas that have started, they've had issues, especially also, it doesn't even have to be a storm or a hurricane, because we have high winds. Sometimes things will get loose and they'll float off. And it's always good to have your gear tagged so that you can recoup the things that you lost. This is my contact information. Please contact me if you have any questions, and I'll take any questions if you all have any. So for the farmers that are permitted or conditionally permitted as of today, that attended this meeting, we will be giving, Texas Sea Grant, we will be giving them, Oyster, gear tags, so that they can put on their farms. And as a favor, please, contact me, if you're conditionally permitted or permitted, and we will work on processing your order so that you can get, gear tags. So thank you for attending this workshop, and have a good day. Thank you all for attending.